Greetings, my name's Andrew Sumner. My grandfather, Pop Smythe, bought me my first comic book in Liverpool, England, when I was 3 years old, and I spent the next 50 years hurtling around the pop culture kaleidoscope, first as a fan, and then as a journalist, editor, publisher and presenter. Along the way, I met a bunch of interesting people who will be joining me here, creators, performers, professionals and public servants. We live in divisive, fractured times, but art and popular culture connect people from all viewpoints and from all walks of life. I'm often struck by the passions people enjoy, that they can set aside their differences for and agree on whatever those passions are, whether I share them or not. And that spark, that moment of instinctive, connective agreement, that's what I call a hard agree. I probably won't go COVID specific on the preamble.
Please don't. Please don't.
So how have you been otherwise, mate? How's work going for you?
Work is okay. Just finished a graphic novel with the artist Rick Taylor, not the American Rick Taylor, the Canadian Rick Taylor. And I did silencers with him. And he came up with his dream project. He wanted to do a love letter to Queen Street, which is a kind of strip of Toronto that runs between University and Spadina. And it was the hub of the art scene in the 70s and 80s. And it's where the Silver Snail was. And
your comic book store, yeah.
Yeah. And so he wanted it to be 1974. I fought him because I thought, well, no, if we move it up to the 80s so we can do comics and we can do all of that. And he went, no, I know exactly what I want. And he had great reasons. And it was a dream to write, one of the most fun things I've ever done. And it's about an art student in 1974. It's really an alternate version of Rick Taylor and his story. What his life would have been if he'd gone to art school and become an artist. He's an artist, but he didn't go the traditional route. So that's been good. I've just finished a bunch of pitches and a bunch of TV show stuff. But, it's tough. I mean, I think COVID has been tough on all of the entertainment industries. And I haven't gone to any conventions in a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, where I would keep up with you and with so many other friends in the industry.
Of course, mate. It's a difference that I felt keenly because, as you know, for the last 20 years, I've spent my life crisscrossing the USA, preaching to the pop culture faithful, as it were. And a big part of my life is being at San Diego, being at New York Comic Con, being at a bunch of other shows in the States as well. And flying the Titan Comics flag and whatnot. It over the last 10 years, that's certainly what I've been doing. And it's definitely a funny thing happened, and I might even have told this story here on the podcast before, but after 20 years of constant travel, suddenly having that grind to a halt at the end of February 2020 was an interesting experience. And a bunch of things went down at work that really slowed down the working experience here in the UK. And so I had a whole ton of holiday banked and whatnot, so I took some time off while things were slow. I would say that suddenly at a certain point, around about June 2020, I began to feel really physically different how I'd felt for a long time. And I couldn't figure out what it was at first. And then I realized it was that I was caught up on my sleep and I wasn't constantly tired. And I woke up in the morning feeling well rested, and I'd walk around the neighborhood, and I've lived in the same part of West London for a very long time, but I never really knew. It was almost like a visitor in my own borough, outside of the things I did with my kids when they were growing up. I really didn't know, my part of London that well. I know it like the back of my hand now. But it was so interesting. And actually, I got to this almost Zen-like point where I felt good about it all about 6 months in. About 15 months in, it's not quite the same. Now I'm kind of itching to get on that plane and start traveling and seeing all my old friends in the US and whatnot.
Yeah, that part of discovering your neighborhood is so crucial. That's exactly what happened to me. And, my life for, so long has been getting on the subway, going to work, working, coming home. And there was a big chunk of the day that was all about work. And then I would come home and I would have dinner and then I would read, but I very seldom, maybe on the weekends, I would venture out. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I was talking to a friend and he said, you know what, you really need to walk more. You need to walk. And my wife walks every morning for about an hour. And I thought,
Yeah.
you know what? I'm going to do that. So at the end of work, I would walk part of the distance home, about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. And just like you, I started to discover my neighborhood, and I would take different routes, and everything was great. And then when everything shut down, then it was like, well, I'm still going to do my walk, but now I have A, more time, and B, I can explore my neighborhood. And so that's how it felt for about a month or two. And then I started thinking about projects and things I could do. And then because I was writing or researching, I would go out in the morning and I would have a problem, or I would have something that I was thinking about. And I would come home and I would be able to spend a couple of hours just essentially writing down what I thought when I was walking. And that fascinates me, that whole we think and walk, and how walking and talking, or walking and communicating, are really linked together for certain people. And it's just changed the way my life is now, because I walk a lot more, and it frees up the way I think.
You and I have actually had a very similar experience, mate, because I one of the things that I introduced to my day as soon as I was grounded at home was going for a daily walk and exploring the neighborhood. And for a very long time through the height of the pandemic, I was doing a solid 2 hours walk every day, without fail. I might cut it into 2 parcels in 1 hour, but that's what I was doing. And I'm not doing it quite that pace now, but I never walk for any less than an hour a day. Like I specifically go for a walk. And I'm probably like yourself. I have a brain that's almost never quiet and turns over all the time. And so the great thing about going for that walk is it just allows me to indulge the various topics and thoughts that I'm whipping around in my mind.
But why is that different? Are those thoughts whipping around your brain different from when you sit at your office chair or when you're walking? They seem to be very, very different from my point of view.
Yeah, me too, mate. And I think it's associative, right? I mean, even if you're at home, but you've during the pandemic created a home workspace, or you always worked at home, it's when you're, because here I am, kind of in my home, in the usual place where I interview and podcast from, but also where I write from, also where I edit from, also where I actually do my job, work a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, all that stuff. It's all done here. So anywhere within the vicinity of this, it feels like the workspace, and it feels like my brain's being channeled in a particular direction. Yeah, via years of nurture rather than nature. Whereas, going out for a walk with a constantly piece of evolving scenery, whatever it may be. And the thing I never do is duplicate the same walk on the bounce. I don't just ritually do the same loops or anything. I'm always trying to shake it up, but it just spurs different things in my mind. And I think it's also the feeling of escape, walking away from your desk and walking out of your home onto the road, onto the street. There's something, whatever the weather is like outside, whether it's terrible, whether it's beautiful, it's a very freeing thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and when I was working at TVO in the 90s, or when I was working at Space in the 2000s, I would walk every day. I would eat lunch at my desk because I never felt I had a lot of time. So I would eat at my desk. But then when I needed a break, and, almost everybody, the great excuse about working is people would go and they would have a cigarette. Well, I don't smoke. Yeah. So, okay, I'll take a 15-minute break and I'll go and do a walk. And it's such a great cultural neighborhood. Look it up on Google Maps sometime. I don't think you've been to, have you been to Toronto?
I have been to Toronto. I've been a couple of times actually, but you and I have never met in Toronto. We've always met in New York. Yeah. The next time I go to Toronto, we'll definitely meet up, mate.
And what's weird is we've never met in San Diego or any of the other conventions. It always seemed that we would meet New York. So I didn't see you in Chicago. I don't know how that happens.
Isn't it funny? I know that is true. And I definitely have similar patterns with other people that I meet at one show and another and never see it the other. I've got a bunch of people who see it both. But that's so true. Given how many years I've been going to San Diego for, it's funny that we never met each other there.
I started going in 86.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant, mate. So, fantastic.
Yeah. Well, it was, this is the story of my life. So I arrived in San Diego in 1986 and everybody tells me, oh, well, the great San Diegos are over. I'm like, what? Yeah. Well, last year was Alan Moore. It was fantastic. All this great stuff is going on. But now it's too big, and it had gotten up to 9,000 people, I think, and people were complaining about it. And I was thinking, this is Mecca. Like, I couldn't believe it. And because, well, I think the first time I went, there were about 7,000 people, and 1,000 of them were professionals. I guess I could count myself as a professional because I was managing the Silver Snail. But the ability to go to dinner and meet Nick Landau and Mike Lake and all the creators, I was a huge fan of the British scene, and to be able to walk into a bar and see Barry Smith there, or Dave Gibbons, or whoever. I mean, I couldn't at that time. I couldn't afford to go to for time or for money, but go to San Diego because it was the Mecca. Everybody would be there, and it was extraordinary. And then for me, in about 2002, that's when I was going for space, and I had a really focused agenda. And that meant that I never really saw anybody. I would have interviews just lined up. I think at the height of Prisoners of Gravity, I was doing 45 or 50 interviews in one San Diego. And so that meant essentially I would be in a hotel room and people would be coming in and we'd be changing the backgrounds. And it was a very funky thing because I never felt that I was at the con. I was con adjacent.
Yes, I get it.
And yet everybody would come up. And then because we worked until 7, generally I would have dinner with my crew, and I wouldn't really, and I had to get to bed early because often I would have to research or I would do whatever. So I might have 2 hours a day where I could socialize or go out and have lunch. Lunch again was a 15-minute situation. But I know how busy you are at the cons. And it's interesting to me because it's almost all work. If you're at dinner, you're often at dinner with clients or you're dinner with your crew or however it works. And you never really turn off. And so convention seasons became a really, big part of our lives, obviously.
No, it's so true. I'm going to take this moment to say, welcome to Hard Agree. My name's Andrew Sumner, and I'm here with my guest, Mark Askwith, producer, writer, fellow interviewer, Mark Askwith. And I think that's the longest we've ever gone into this episode before I've actually introduced who the guest is, which is the way that my conversations with Mark always go, by the way. And to return, Mark, before we start talking about you and your career path, as to your point, and we're talking about, of course, the convention experience, particularly at San Diego and New York. But for me, even though I've been doing both of those shows for a very long, put a vast amount of work into both of them with my team, who you've also met a number of times. Really, the apex for us is San Diego because that's the kind of the progenitor of it all, and that's the original non-profit for the good of the medium. It's not, say, the thing about New York Comic Con, which is a great event, which I love, but that thing exists to make money for Reed, right? Whereas San Diego Comic Con exists to benefit and promote the art form itself, which I think is a beautiful thing. But the thing about that show particularly is when I just think of the huge amount of work that the Titan crew put into that very large booth that we have at San Diego. And so, essentially a regular San Diego day for us is you get it up at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, you're grabbing some breakfast, you're doing all the stuff on the booth, you run the booth all day, and then you get people like myself who have to go away and take some off-site business meetings. And then I MC our Titan Comics and Titan Books panel at San Diego, so I'd go and host those, and then do various other things like I'll do the diamond presentation to the comic book retailers about what our plans are, all that kind of stuff. And then when we hit the evening, then it's like you're entertaining your key business associates, whether that's creators or whether it's the very cool American retailers or global retailers that we work with. So the whole thing is, I think we're just on fumes by the end of it. And I think it's probably 3 to 4 hours sleep a night is the maximum you get. Well, a lot of the cats who work for me are 25 years younger than I am. Yeah, but everybody's wiped out at the end of it, you know. And what I frequently have to do when I get back home after San Diego, particularly, and also New York Comic Con, is essentially I have a week where I just completely wipe out and can't do anything. You know, it's not unusual for me to spend almost 2-3 days asleep. Like it's like going away on a trawler and coming back after working 48-hour days. You just totally spent at the end of it, but spent in a glorious way, I think, Mark.
Yeah, it's funny. I asked Frank Miller about this once, and he said it takes him 3 days to recover from each day he spends at a con, which is tough. I mean, that's tough. My problem with conventions, not my problem, but I would have to shoot the convention. So often it was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And on Sunday, I would leave and I would take the red eye because I would have to get into the office really early and then make a story for Monday about San Diego. So I would have to, I mean, I didn't have a chance to have that unwind period because Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I would be creating stories. And then generally, I mean, I might do a story on Friday, but generally I would say, you know, I'm out or I'm doing something completely different. And then Friday and then get Saturday and Sunday off and somewhere hope that I would get a day off. But it's hard to explain because the nature of television and my kind of television was that you had to get it on air as quickly and as expediently as possible and showcase all of what a convention is about. So like New York Comic Con to me is so different from San Diego. So as a storyteller, how do I set those up? And so locators work, crowd shots work, cosplay work, but also then it becomes the guests and what are the things that you talk about. And often you and I would talk because when I was interviewing you, it was for Space, which was Canada's national science fiction channel. It's now been rebranded as CTV Sci-Fi. But back in the day, we would have certain shows like Doctor Who. So I would seek out the British guests, even if they didn't have anything to do with Doctor Who, but they could talk about it and they would have a Doctor Who story. And then, of course, you guys were a goldmine because Titan handled all these wonderful Doctor Who products. So I think there were 3 years in a row where you were definitely a part of my Doctor Who coverage. Because, maybe Tuesday would be Doctor Who and then Wednesday would be Battlestar Galactica. You know, I would pace out the stories so that if you were into toys, there'd be a day that you could watch on Space would cover the toy bit. And then there'd be a day where you could catch up on, television. Because I spent a lot of time in, interviewing movie stars and television stars. But to me, it's all part, like what I wanted to show was this is a community. Because as you know, an Andrew Sumner is there next to maybe an actor like, I don't know, Peter Capaldi. Yeah. And so what you want to do is have this great collision of that person is famous, that person isn't, but they're both talking about Doctor Who, which I think fans relate to.
Yeah, I think that's so true, mate. Now, before we get back onto our pop culture and comics focus, pop culture focus, I'd just like to take you, if you could talk me through, you've got to have had a particularly interesting career and some interesting steps in your career. So do you just want to take me through the basic planks of it, Mark?
Well, it's weird that you call them steps. They didn't feel like steps.
No, they happened organically without you noticing, I'm sure.
They happened organically and they were real quantum leaps. So I got a very good education from the University of Toronto and I came out and I started working for a small press called Coaxial. And we published Margaret Atwood and Michael Ondaatje and an author called B.P. Nicol. And B.P. Nicol became my mentor. And at some point in early 1982, B.P. Nicol said, do you want to be the 50th best designer in Canada, or do you want to be the best in the world at something? And I, of course, like any young kid, I went like, I want to be the best in the world. And he said, nobody understands comics like you do. Nobody. I've never met anybody who gets them. So you should do that. And at the time, I was at a crisis in my life personally. I just didn't know what I wanted to do. I loved Coaxial. I loved the people, but I felt a bit like I'm in paradise, but I'm in somebody else's paradise. Yeah. Like, this is wonderful, but it just didn't line up. So a friend was getting married in Greece and I went to Greece and then I toured around and I ended up in London and I went into the Forbidden Planet, and I had never seen a store like that. And I met Lick Landau and I met Mike Lake, and they were like, these are people like me.
By the way, for anybody, I've probably not mentioned this on the show, but if anybody ever watches me in my other guys presenting Forbidden Planet TV, they'll know that I work for Forbidden Planet. I present its YouTube channel, and I do a bunch of other things there as well. I'm the EVP at Titan, and Nick Landau's my boss. That's the fact. Brilliantly.
But we were all long-haired guys, and we were all into it, and they energized me and they changed me. I came back to Toronto, and the Silver Snail were deciding that they were going to move into distribution. They became Andromeda Distribution, so they needed a manager of their store, the Silver Snail on Queen Street. So I was like, yeah, I'm in. And 1982, 1983, moving things along. And in 1983, we had a guest appearance program from Paul Smith, who was on the X-Men at the time. And I did an interview with him.
Paul Smith.
Great artist, great run.
And I interviewed him Doctor Strange as well, I thought.
Yeah, he went to, he did a ton of other stuff.
Yeah.
And is an animator. But what was interesting is that I interviewed him, and we were kind of doing a magazine, and we're doing various things. And he was like, you should get into comedy. He was so supportive. And I'm like, well, I'm doing this now, but, maybe we'll see. I wanted to write comics, but at the moment, this is my job. I'm running the store. But he must have said nice things to Marvel or nice things to people. And so people said, well, we want to come up to the store. So I had Bill Sienkiewicz. I had a number of other people coming up. And then I went, this is the middle of 1983. And I said, oh my God, I have an opportunity to be an evangelist for comics, because I have the store. I knew the people at Much Music. I knew the people at, basically MTV in the States. I had all kinds of contacts like that, and people, because the people shopped there, and producers from the CBC, producers from radio. So then in about 84, I became a regular on a really famous radio show in Canada in the morning. And I started doing various things. And then in 1985, people discovered, comics in a big way.
Yeah.
And then 1986 was the year of Mao's Watchmen and Dark Knight.
Yeah.
And I was, I had Frank Miller, was a friend, and these people were known to me. And because I was a retailer, I had a certain weird access. And so my Rolodex grew, and all these artists, like, I suddenly realized, well, I know all these people, mostly North American, to be honest. And at some point I thought, well, I want us to become a publisher. We'll do, Silver Snail Comics. And we did one called Pork Night. And it made the artist and writer, Wob Walton, a lot of money. And, I thought, well, this is it. This is what I want to do. And the owner of the Silver Snail said, no, I want you to keep doing what you're doing. And I said, look, I'm working like 85 hours. I did the math, and I figured out that the high school kids were getting paid more than I was. And this was an owner who knew that I, bled the Silver Snail. I bled comics. So I would never leave. But I said, like, this is insane. Like, this doesn't work. The math doesn't work. And so I had to leave, and it was heartbreaking. It was horrible. And I thought, well, like, what's a comic book guy going to do? I mean, there's nothing out there. I mean, I don't know. I can't walk into New York. I can't get a job as a writer. I tried. I was friends with a lot of the editors and our writers and artists, and they were really, really helpful. And at some point I realized, wait a minute, if I'm supposed to be the guy, then why don't I pitch an idea? So I talked to a producer called Ron Mann, who wanted to make a comic book movie, a documentary,
which is phenomenal, by the way. I love it, and I own it. Comic Book Confidential, right?
Comic Book Confidential, and so he wanted to be basically a Valentine to Marvel. And I said, my God, you like, I knew him because I knew him from, he made a documentary about Coaxial. And I said, no, you're into burros and counterculture, and you've got to make a movie with Robert Crumb, like, and you can get him, because Robert Crumb will get, and if you get him, then you can get Kirby, Eisner, Kurtzman. And then I went, oh my God, like, those are the four guys. And you could do a documentary essentially about the roots of comics, and they're all alive. I couldn't believe it. And then he said, well, yeah, I know, but I want to talk about current stuff as well. And I'm like, okay, here's Mouse, here's Dark Knight, here's American Splendor. And I just loaded him up with about 200 comics. And I thought, this happens all the time too. As you know, people come in, producers or people, and then they go, thank you very much, but I'm not going to do it. And his reaction was the opposite. He's like, holy, this is amazing. This fits my sensibility. This is exactly what I should do. And so I did that, and that won basically the Canadian equivalent of the Oscar, which was great. And then on the strength of that, a producer that had worked with me at the CBC.
I saw that when it was first released in London, and I saw it at the ICA in what I think was 88, but might be 1989. The first year, pretty much, of me actually having a legit job, in the media industry, and very, very early days. I'd just it was within a year of me finishing grad school. Yeah. And if that's what you call doing a postgraduate qualification, and yeah, I remember it very clearly. Very, very
wow,
clearly. Had a beautiful soundtrack.
Yeah, the soundtrack is amazing. Paul Mavrides and the poster and everything is amazing.
Yeah.
But the what changed my life was that Ron Mann very generously invited me when there was a Canadian premiere that I couldn't make, because The Prisoner launched the same day, the same weekend, and I got married.
And by the way, The Prisoner, I want to talk to you about in a little bit, because we've got a shared history with that. But
imagine that, though. Comic Book Confidential world premiere, getting married, and on that Thursday, The Prisoner comic hit stores.
Amazing, man.
So it was
amazing.
I mean, I don't know how my biorhythm was, but it was pretty amazing. And but he invited me to New York for the opening in New York. So I did a lot of press. And then we had dinner. And the dinner was Robert Crumb, Gilbert Shelton, who, like Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, my hero, Linda Barry, my hero, and Will Eisner, my hero. Like amazing. It was like I couldn't believe it. And I'm feeling like I'm just this ex-retailer, and this is crazy. Like, it was crazy. But then a producer came and said to me, "Look, if I ever have the power, I'm going to bring you on, and you're going to be a producer." And then he called me up and he said, that idea we've been talking about. Well, I'm now the creative head of arts at TVO, and come and pitch me. So I pitched him, and he said, you're going to do a 7-minute show between 2 episodes of Doctor Who. So I owe my career to Doctor Who. And then they lost the rights to Doctor Who. So he said, well, sorry, dude, that's it, great idea. And I had the insane idea. And I said, dude, let's make it a half-hour show. And that became Prisoners of Gravity, which ran for 5 years and won a ton of awards and was the greatest. I couldn't believe that I would ever top it, because the show was built around everything I liked. So it was science fiction, fantasy, comic books, and, movies and television, like cool stuff that we're all into, nerdy, genre stuff. And, we did one of the very first television interviews with Neil Gaiman. I got to interview Alan Moore. I got to interview Jack Kirby, hundreds and hundreds of writers and creators.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy, like Matt Groening, and it depends who you are, like who's famous. Like somebody goes, "Oh my God, you interviewed so-and-so." And you want to go, you have no idea. Like, it was an insane time. And after 5 years, they decided, okay, we've served that audience. And so I became the showrunner on Canada's flagship literary show, which is called Imprint, which was a great experience and fantastic, but really, dealing with really famous, hardcore literary authors. And that was great. I mean, I really enjoyed that. And I thought when after 2 years, I left it, and I thought, I never want to read another book or comic again. I'm out. I don't want to work in television. Television is dead to me. And I decided I'm going to write comics, and I'm going to get back into that world. So that was 1996, beginning of 97. Sorry, 97.
Yeah.
And so that was fine. And then I started working for a company called Studio X, and another company called Mackerel, and they were digital companies, and they had these brilliant ideas, and I knew nothing because I'm 500 years old, so I didn't understand this whole digital analog thing that was going on at that time. And then both of them closed on the same day, on August the 15th, and I was like, oh my God, how do you lose two jobs on the same day? And that day, Space got its license. And Space, of course, as I've mentioned, is Canada's national science fiction channel. And I contacted them because I thought, well, I have to. And they contacted me. Like, it was one of those weird things. And so the person in charge of it was a woman called Marcy Martin. And she said, people are coming in here and they're pitching themselves. And their big selling point is they know you. So we have to meet you. I'm like, really? She's like, yeah. So-and-so and so-and-so, like all these people that come into her office, and their big thing was, I actually am a friend of, Mark Askwith. I'm like, oh, well, all right. I'm glad to hear that. And so she said, I don't have the money and I don't have the position, but you have to work for us. And then she worked things out. I became one of the founding producers of Space. I promised her 5 years, and I thought, that's it. I'll launch it. But I hate television. Like, I want to be in radio, or I want to be in comics, or, but I don't want to be in TV. I just have a frustration with the pace of that life. I mean, it's fine if you're 25, but if, you're a 40-year-old guy and you're making television, it's hard. Yeah. And then I fell in love with the group of people I was working with. And then as you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, everything started to exponentially change. And 2002, when Halle Berry and Hugh Jackman showed up at Comic-Con, you could feel the needle was about to completely go. And I knew it because I could feel it, and I'd been there. And so I thought, well, I can't leave now, even though 2002 is sort of my exit date. And I just thought, this is exactly the most exciting place to be in the world, is covering pop culture right now. And then it didn't stop for 20 years. I mean, it's been an amazing run,
It has been unbelievable, hasn't it, mate? That this last 20 years, if you're in the pop culture business and you've spent your entire life being focused on it, to see it to take over the mainstream in the way it has, is really quite an amazing ride to have been on.
It is. And to see friends work on, Mike Mignola or Neil Gaiman or Alan Moore on Jeopardy.
Yeah.
And a couple of comic book people died recently, and they got write-ups in the New York Times. Yeah. Jack Kirby died. I tried to get him a write-up in the New York Times. I had an interview with him that I sent to all the American broadcasters. Nobody aired it. I said, I am offering this up. I work for basically the PBS of Canada. Please, pick whatever you want from this. We're not going to charge you, but you have to talk about the impact that Jack Kirby had. And we couldn't get it done. Art Spiegelman got it done. So all praise to Art. But that's how different things were. That's a sea change. Now, it's become part of the mainstream, which is it's wonderful for me. But I kind of feel like, well, what's the next frontier? What's the next thing? And I remember being ridiculed in the early 80s for saying, and I was quoted in the Globe and Mail as saying, comics are a medium and not a genre. And everybody rolled their eyes and everybody went, what a pretentious piece of shit. Come on. And I'm like, but it's true. Comics are a medium. And it's weird to me that mainstream in the comic book world meant X-Men and Wolverine and superheroes, and mainstream in the real world marginalizes this stuff. So to live in that world and to live in the television world, because I had these two worlds, I always I really felt like an embedded journalist, because I had access. The other thing is that I was really interested in science. So because Space was allowed to do anything that I wanted to do, I covered a lot of science. So I got to interview Buzz Aldrin and tons of scientists and, Dr. Stephen Hawking, tons of physicists, just a miracle job.
I mean that must have been wonderful for you, mate. As a science aficionado, that must have been incredible.
Well, science fiction comics. So when you got burned out of comics, you go, okay, now I'll just do some literature. And you do some literature, and then you go, I'm really tired of that. Let's go do science. And then you do that. And, interviewing people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Greene, that whole side. And, people in comics always want to talk to me about the comic book people. Literature, people interested in literature want me to talk about authors. But the science people are like, holy shit, like you've interviewed 100 astronauts. I'm like, yep. As a 12-year-old boy growing up in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, you couldn't even conceive of that. I got to interview Russian astronauts, which blew my mind. Like, this is amazing. I'm finally getting to interview. I mean, I love the Russian program more than I love the American program. But anyway, sorry, we digress.
But not really, because it's so on point, mate. It's so on point. And what you're saying, the whole concept of having spent that kind of pop culture career and the 10-year-old in you going, that is amazing, particularly given where you started from. It's like me starting in the northwest of England in Merseyside, essentially being, quite harshly challenged on the local trains on match day when Liverpool or Everton were playing. But I'd be sitting there reading my Batman comics, and that led to quite a few altercations. Starting from that point, 10 years old in Merseyside, and then having a career, in American pop culture, I had no idea of how I could plot that course. I still don't even really know how I did it now. To me, it's.
I completely agree with you. And that's the other thing that you mentioned, just, you're from Merseyside. I'm from Ottawa, Ontario. Frank Miller is from Vermont. Like, you look at the trajectories of these people and you go, wait a minute. I mean, Guillermo del Toro, for, Mexico, like, how are these people? And when you meet them, you all have this commonality because you weren't from, the places like Hollywood or New York where this stuff was going to happen. Because he moved to Toronto, I got to meet the great director of the zombie film, and it was wild. He moved here, but he was from Pittsburgh. He never felt like, he was part of the mainstream. And of course, Canada has David Cronenberg. And he never felt part of the mainstream. Almost, Margaret Atwood, like, what do you do with her? Is she a major author or but she's a nerd.
Yeah,
she loves comics. She did comics when she was at university.
I think that amalgamation of outsiders is really a key constituent to the whole pop culture business, the whole pop culture ethos, the whole pop culture industry, and you encounter it time and time again. How did you end up doing this? Is a really interesting question, I think. It's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, because very few people start out as establishment figures, because there wasn't an establishment for a start. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there's no pop culture establishment. I mean, people forget, because of the speed with which it's exploded, that if you take a time machine back to 2007, an average person on the street has no idea who Tony Stark is, has no idea who Steve Rogers is, right? And if you ask them to name the real identity of a superhero, pretty much people can only say Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent, and some people can say Peter Parker, but that's it. Nobody knows jack shit outside of comic book aficionados. And these characters that are now preeminent in global entertainment, the whole world knows. Here's another one, right, mate? 2007. Ask anybody on the street, what is it that Captain America's special powers are? What can he do? People nobody knew, and now the fact that he's a super soldier, all that, everybody knows it, right? The change in and how much that information has embedded itself into our culture, how famous Tony Stark is as a character. That's only taken 13 years to go from no one knows to everyone knows. And now Marvel movies outperform everything, including the Star Wars universe. It's really been quite an amazing thing to watch.
It's extraordinary. And as far as Marvel goes, you have to look at the team of the brilliant brain trust, to me, Kevin Feige and that team. But also, it's amazing to look back. I thought Iron Man 1 was a pretty good film. I mean, I thought it was fine. It did what it had to do. It was good. And that was great. As a comic book fan, you're like, yay. And then these films started to follow. And I mean, I'm really lucky. I got to go to media screenings of this stuff. I got to interview people and whatever. But I remember avoiding the media screening for the last two Avengers movies. And I wanted to see them with real people. And because I didn't want, I just didn't want to do that. And I knew I often had to make pieces, but I would use the EPK or I would use the interviews we did. But then I thought, no, I want that experience of being an idiot sitting in the cinema with my popcorn. And I remember, I will never forget the moment that sorry, spoiler coming, Steve Rogers, Captain America, catches Thor's hammer.
Wow. Yeah, of course.
And the audience went bananas. It was like a touchdown had been scored or a soccer goal or, for me, hockey. Like I had never seen a group of people erupt with such passion and such cheer. It was crazy. And I thought, wow, they've actually paced this movie wrong because now people are going so crazy for the next 10 or 15 seconds that we can't hear any of the dialogue. You couldn't hear any of the dialogue. And that was a real breakthrough for me. The other one was I got to see I was on set of the first Tim Burton Batman movie, which is actually where I met Neil Gaiman, which is another story. But I got invited to 2 preview screenings for that film. And the first one, and you'll get this because you're in the industry and you're involved with toy people, but it was the licensees screening. Yeah. And it was hilarious because you would go and I'd be going, oh, this is great. This is great. And there'd be silence. And then someone's product would show up, like the Batmobile, and a little section of the audience would cheer. And then the moment where the bat plane came up in front of the moon, and the whole bat plane, whoever had the license, they went bananas. They just went crazy. And afterwards, I went out to drink with a bunch of the guys who were there, and they were all going, wow, my product got, great placement, and I'm going to sell a ton of this stuff. And I'm like, I'm so glad I'm not in retail anymore. But at the same time, oh my God, Marvel and, DC Comics and their licensors, this is going to be a sea change. And I remember I visited Paul Levitz a few weeks or months before that movie opened. And I think DC were worried. I think they'd seen the cut. They were a little bit worried. And I was like, this is going to be a smash. He said, how do you know? I said, because all the black bike couriers in Toronto are wearing the black T-shirts, and black T-shirts are sold out in Toronto. He's like, what? I'm like, everybody is wearing the Batman shirt. Yeah. And he goes, well, why? And I said, I got to be honest. I don't think it's Batman. I think it's the Joker, and I think it's the soundtrack. Whoever decided that Prince should do
the Prince
that
soundtrack,
music, that was a game changer for that movie and for popular culture. So all of a sudden, Batman, which was known as, a certain thing, was on a TV show and Adam West played him and whatever, became a completely different thing. It became this gothic urban nightmare. And that movie is like really underrated as far as all of that goes, as far as I'm concerned.
I agree. I mean, I think I was completely obsessed with that movie when it came out as, a lifelong Batman fan, and saw it a ridiculous number of times. It's probably the last film that I saw multiple times in the cinema, which is something I just don't do anymore, completely grown out of that. But it had a huge impact upon me, while also I knew in real time that's an imperfect film. It's very poorly plotted. It's very poorly scripted. It's full of holes. Burton is a brilliant visual stylist. I'm not convinced he's any good with narrative at all. But for all its holes, there's also so many brilliant things about it, not the least of which is, if you've read Batman comics since you were 3, and I don't get me wrong, I've talked about Adam West many times on the show, and I love Adam West, and I love 60s Batman. That's where my love of Batman comes from. But I was desperate for Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil Batman on screen, and then to suddenly get it in the way that it landed, and for, Jack Nicholson was great and took all the oxygen of publicity at the time. But in fact, Keaton's amazing in the film. And, he's got all the love he has now because he was just so good. That was the thing that could have really sunk the film, getting Bruce Wayne and Batman wrong. But nonetheless, it's an imperfect artifact, I think, because when you watch it now, all its flaws are laid bare. And once the kind of excitement, the chain reaction excitement is gone. But what is absolutely true is his cultural impact was amazing. Absolutely amazing.
And they got one thing right. You cast Bruce Wayne. You cast Tony Stark. You don't cast Iron Man. Yeah. The only one where it gets a little fudgy is Superman and Captain America, because the way those masks work, or lack of mask in the case of Superman, I mean, then that becomes important. But otherwise, like Iron Man, like really, you got to nail Tony Stark. Batman, you got to nail Bruce Wayne. But you're right. And because at that point I was now in media, and I had made the move from being a retailer and working in wholesale. It was like you could see that it was having a change. It was also one of those things where I would be able to say to people at DC, you have no idea what's happening in stores. They cannot keep Dark Knight in print. Like 25, 30 copies of Dark Knight were shooting out of the store every day. Like retailers were, they kind of knew the rhythm of their product. But the same thing happened with Watchmen. When that trailer opened for the first, Nolan Batman movie, and they did the Watchmen trailer, I was at the media screening with my daughter, and she turned to me and said, "Dad, do we have that?" I'm like, "Oh, yes, we have that." And she said, "I want you to read it to me." But they then sold more copies of Watchmen were sold in the 6 weeks after the dropping of that trailer that had been sold since 1986.
Yeah.
So that's the power of popular culture.
1,000%, mate.
And I was on set of the Watchmen, which was really fun, and got to interview the team and Zack Snyder and the actors because it was shot in Vancouver, and I'm Canadian journalist. Oh my God! Okay, so I have to. So people like you, who we feel are embedded in this industry, we never know what our impact is going to be. I'm on set and I'm talking to the set designer. And Alex is a great guy. And we were talking, and I said, the first interview I want to do is setting everything up. And I want it to be by the kiosk, where the kid is reading the comics, which if you know the graphic novel,
if you know Watchmen is a key place. Yeah.
That's right. So we did the bulk of the interview there. And then I said, I want to move it. I want to do two or three other locations. And he said, well, how about let's go to the restaurant where, Dryberg takes Laurie. I said, no, nothing really happens in there except for maybe the four-legged turkey. What? The four-legged turkey? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, there's a four-legged turkey, which kind of sets up the whole idea of cloning and the fact that Dr. Manhattan has allowed that, and that sets up the squid. Just a minute. Where is that? I said, it's in the first issue. It's about page 21, 22. It's near the end or whatever. I've forgotten the number. He goes, just a minute. Hello, it's Alex. Do you have a copy of The Watchmen there? Okay, the scene at where I've forgotten the name of the restaurant. It goes, is there a four-legged turkey? And the guy at the end of the phone or the woman at the end of the phone says, yes. And of course, it's in the movie, but they didn't have time to make it a prop because they were shooting that scene the next day. So you can hear it in the audio, which was hilarious from my point of view. And I said, no, I want to do the interviews at Gunga Diner. And then I wanted to so we did a bunch of stuff outside the movie theater and then outside of Gunga Diner. And then a real pleasure for me, I did one outside one of the poster walls, because I think what Dave Gibbons did in terms of the posters and Pale Horse and all that stuff, it was amazing. Anyway, that's one of the seminal graphic novels for me. But being on set of that was blowing my mind. I couldn't believe it. And I wore my Silver Snail jacket because I thought there's going to be one guy on the crew who is going to know that. And I was wrong. Like 20 of the guys on the crew. And they all came out, you're Mr. Snail. Hi, Mr. Snail. And so they all knew about the store because a lot of the guys who were interested in comics had worked in Toronto and then moved to work on the X-Files or moved to work on Lois and Clark or some of the other stuff that was shooting in Vancouver. And, it was about, that was probably the greatest weekend of my life, just going to the Watchmen set, because I'd lived with it for so long. I knew Alan and Dave. I knew what this meant to Dave. It was just an amazing thing. And I wish that I was able to go on set of The Sandman, but with COVID and everything locked down, it's not going to happen. Yeah, but I'm really looking forward to Neil's Sandman. That's going to be really cool. It's
going to be epic. And have you checked out Dirk's Audible version of it?
My God, that man's a genius. Right?
Dirk Maggs is an amazing guy. Yeah, he's an amazing player.
I've never met him, but that guy, I respect him greatly. That's an amazing piece of work.
Well, I'm lucky enough to call Dirk Maggs my friend. We once collaborated when I was at IPC, when I was publishing the various men's and music mags I used to publish, before I was at Titan. One of the things I did was I looked after all the old British comic books that IPC, Time Warner, still owned. The Valiant and Lion, the Steelclaw, all those kind of characters. But the other thing we owned, which another acquaintance of mine, Michael Moorcock, used to work on, was Sexton Blake. And so Dirk adapted a comedy version of Sexton Blake for the BBC. And so I got to know him back then. This is almost 20 years ago now, I think. But yeah, he is... The quality of his work, nobody can beat Dirk in audio. He's in a super league of his own. He's in a premiership of one, and it's him. And the work that he's done on Sandman for Audible, just unbelievable. It's amazing.
So you mentioned Moorcock, and this is where our lives kind of eddy and circle. So I went to UCAC, or Prisoners of Gravity, mostly because I wanted to interview Neil Gaiman, Dave McKean, the British artists, and some guy called Alan Moore.
Yeah.
And so I went over to do that interview, and Alan's interview was on the Wednesday, which was going to be the last day. And then I was going to fly out on the Thursday. But we discovered at a flyer at the Forbidden Planet that there was going to be a launch of this magazine, New World, relaunching with Brian Aldiss and Michael Moorcock. So we changed our flights, and the brilliant Greg Thurlbeck, who is the director, and we did a lot of the interviews in that season, and we stayed, and I interviewed Brian Aldiss and Michael Moorcock. And the Michael Moorcock interview, like for somebody who at the age of 12 was reading, Elric Elric changed my life. It's funny. And then Neil Gaiman wrote that story, the comic about how, being influenced by Moorcock. And I had to laugh because I thought that's every kid in that period. Michael Moorcock was,
he's undoubtedly the man. And the guy's a genius. He's a self-facing genius. He has the best stories. Yeah. So I don't know if you know this, mate, or if you checked it out, but one of the things that's part of Hard Degree is I do an irregular series with Mike Moorcock. It's called Michael Moorcock's Multiverse, which is him delivering stories from his life. And it's because we chatted for we talked dealing with a whole bunch of Titan projects, because one of the things we've done at Titan Comics is we've collected all of his graphic novel work in one consistent library edition, which is beautiful, by the way. So it's his and P. Craig Russell's Elric. It's a bunch of other great stuff. We're very proud of it. And Nick Lando's big Michael Moorcock fan, has known him for years as well. But in the course of us, talking about these various projects, we realized that we got on pretty well. So, he's quite... One of the things that we wanted to do is just lay down some of these amazing anecdotes he's got from this incredibly varied career he's got, because he's not just an author. He's a screenwriter. He scripted The Land That Time Forgot. He's a musician.
Hawkwind.
He worked
Mother
with Hawkwind, the Blue Oyster Cult, just unbelievable. And he has the most amazing stories, and he's completely candid. So I know you're a fellow Moorcock lover, but you should check that strand out, mate. I think you'd enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, he has two of my favorite three actually of my favorite things that happen on Prisoners of Gravity. One, I asked him, tell me about the multiverse. And he looked at me and he goes, it's my brain. It's how I think. I thought, okay, that's a great answer. Yeah. And then I was doing an episode on dreams because I'd gotten these fantastic interviews about dreams and dreaming and how dreams were affecting people. So I've got Michael Moorcock, so I've got to ask him. So I said, what do you dream of? How have your dreams influenced you? And he looked at me and goes, oh, I have the most boring dreams. I go to Tesco and I buy cheese. That's the greatest. That's great. Because, of course, if you know his work, he's living in the dreaming. This guy lives. And then the other thing that was cool is, so we're doing it at the launch of New Worlds, and we're in the back room of Titan. I think like literally the back room.
Yeah.
And somebody must have waved through a door. And Michael Moorcock in the middle of the interview said, excuse me. And he got up and walked out, and he's wired up and everything. And he walks out. And so we turned off the audio to give him some privacy. And I'm thinking they're going like, what am I going to do? Like, he just walked out. Is he going to come back? And about a minute later, to his credit, he came and sat down, and we ran the whole time because, you want that moment. And I got back to Toronto, and we were working on a show. And I went, the show would be perfectly structured if I had Michael Moorcock at the beginning of it and then Michael Moorcock at the end, because he sets the idea up and then he finishes it brilliantly. And then I went, oh my God, I have it. So I've got my host, Rick Green, asking him a question. And Michael says, excuse me, I have to go. And he gets up and leaves. And as a producer, then I put in all the other interviews. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, then we cut to Michael Moorcock coming back and sitting back in the chair. And Rick begins, the interview that will end the show. And I just remember thinking, he has no way, like, he's so brilliant that he gave me a gift that at the time, neither of us knew was a gift. I just think, like, Michael Moorcock is the man. He's tied into a whole other frequency that we can only occasionally hear. And he's tuned in 24/7.
That's a hard agree from me, mate. And you and I are both 100% on the same page. Yeah, I could not agree more. And, it's very rare that somebody you admire their genius turns out to be so genial and pleasant and such a great person to hang out with. And that is exactly what he is. And he's just written a new Elric, which he's publishing next year. Can't wait for it, mate. But let's close out on talking about.
Can you believe we burned off an hour?
I knew this would happen. I absolutely knew this would happen. Let's close out on a great sort of mutual love of ours, the ITC pantheon. So this is an audio podcast. So what you can't see during our conversation is I'm sitting in front of John Steed's bowler hat and umbrella. Mark is sitting in front of the penny farthing from The Prisoner. So you don't get much more ITC than that, although technically, I guess, Avengers is not really an ITC show. But, mate, so something that we're very proud of publishing at Titan is a graphic novel called Shattered Visage. And Shattered Visage is a graphic novel tied around the classic Prisoner TV series, created by and starring Patrick McGowan. And the co-writer of that excellent graphic novel, which you're proud to publish, is Mark Askwith. So, mate, what does The Prisoner mean to you, and how did that project come to be?
That's a really complicated question. I don't even know how to answer that. And I've been asked it a number of times. But I was fascinated by spies growing up, and I was really interested in them. And I later found, after the death of my father, that he was in Canadian intelligence. But I didn't know that at the time. But he used to take me to James Bond movies, and then we started watching The Prisoner together. And I remember the first episode, and it was good. It was fine. But I remember the next episode, The Chimes of Big Ben, and I just thought it was the greatest thing on television I had ever seen. I just thought, this is it. What a great show. And I would watch them with my dad whenever I could. And then we watched the last two together. And I think it's weird. I think the British got the show, and then Canada got it very shortly after you. But then there was a lag. I don't think Americans got the show. But
no, I think that's right. I think that's right, mate.
But I don't really know.
That's so often the case with British TV in Canada, isn't it? It's very close to
absolutely. Monty Python is the same thing.
Yeah.
But I remember at the end of that show, my dad said, what's going on? Like, what do you think happened? And we had this long discussion about what we thought happened and who was number one and all that stuff. But for me, it was very tied to my father and watching the show with my dad, because we didn't really, we watched the Montreal Canadian hockey games, but this was one of the few TV shows that we watched together. So anyway, cut to the probably 89, just before maybe 88. And maybe 7. And I start writing a spy graphic novel with Rick Taylor called Silencers. And I wrote it, and it was 4 issues and plotted everything out. And I had written it, and then Rick Taylor was going to draw it. And in that period, Dean Motter, who was a regular at the Silver Snail and, just a great guy. And Dean and I, we talked a lot, and we would jam on things like Mr. X, which is a Canadian comic book at the time with Dean and Paul Ravache who were working on it.
Wonderful book, Mr. X.
Yes, wonderful book and great posters and all that kind of stuff. And we would go to a local restaurant called the Rivoli and we would hash stuff out. And I was just there as a sidekick or, just a guy on the sidelines. And there was another great guy on the sidelines, Ken Stacy. A lot of people were supporting this project. And then it all kind of changed. And the Hernandez brothers did the first 4 issues. And it didn't it became their thing for a time being. However, in that period, with Mr. X getting so much buzz, Dean was approached by DC and they said, we want you to create something for us. And he said to me, well, if you had any dream project, what would it be? And I said, well, probably Green Lantern. I love Green Lantern. And he goes, no, I'm not interested in that. And I said, well, Batman, there's some cool Batman stories. I'd love to do a Two-Face story. I'd love to do a story about how the Bat Cave gets built. And he goes, no. And I went, well, obviously, if you're talking dream projects, like it'll never happen, but it would be to do kind of a sequel to the Prisoner TV show. And Dean just lit up. He's like, oh, what a great idea. And then we started bouncing around ideas. And at that point, I just thought, well, I'm just a friend of Dean's. He's going to pitch 6 things to DC. Something will happen. He'll probably end up working, with, Grant Morrison on something because he was known as an artist and, whatever. And then he came back from New York and he goes, you're not going to believe it, but they went for the Prisoner idea. So we had to write it up formally. We did the whole thing. And then Dean said, okay, we'll co-plot it. And then you could write the dialogue and I'll draw it. I'm like, well, okay. And still not really believing it because this is my favorite television show of all time. Yeah. And I still can't believe that it's going to happen. And I kept thinking, because I am a practical man, well, wait a minute. You got to get the rights to Patrick McGoohan because I want to do it with Patrick McGoohan. You have to get the rights to Leo McKern. That's never going to happen. You probably have to work a rights deal with ITC or whoever owns the rights. We don't even know that. You have to probably work out with the other, it's just a nightmare. But I have the DNA of a producer. So I was looking at this going, it will never happen because these are all the hurdles that have to happen. So anyway, we wrote up the proposal and then it took about a year. And then Chantal Denis, who's the brilliant lawyer for DC, came back and said, okay, this is what you can do. This is what you can't do. But we have the licenses to use Patrick McGoohan and Leo McKern, which was like angels were singing. And I just thought, amazing. Oh my God. Like this is crazy. I thought
at the time, because I bought it in its original format, it's 4 prestige issues. At the time, I thought it was amazing that DC had got the likenesses to those guys.
It was crazy, and to me, it would only work if you got them. And then the other thing that was sort of radical was he's not going to be like Patrick McGoohan is not going to be the center of the story. He's going to be more like Sandman. He's this weird character who is the most important character. But really, it's happening around him. This other relationship is happening. And Dean and I wanted to do a strong female character. We really had this idea of what we wanted to do, but it would be somebody coming into that world. But I remember my favorite moment about the whole thing was Dean and I plotting it out. And at some point, I said, because we both agreed we wanted to be in the Village. We loved Port Marion. I knew that Dean and I are design nerds, so I knew we were going to be doing all the design stuff. And I said, we can build the bicycle on the back covers. We can do all this stuff. We knew what the font was. It was so exciting. And then I suddenly realized, well, we have a major problem. We want to set it in the Village, but there's no way the Prisoner is going to be in the Village. Like, it doesn't make any sense. He'd be in the real world. He'd be in London. It doesn't make any sense. So the core idea, the core visual ideas were done. Like, it's not going to work. And I said that to Dean. I said, look, from being the designated asshole on this team, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. And this is why. And he was very patient. He said, yeah, but easy, you'll figure it out. And so, because it's my dream project, it has to happen. And I had one of the images that he and I really agreed on. And we were both, so I went to the Marvel offices and I got to see the Jack Kirby artwork, the original artwork for that, which blew my mind.
Which as you may also know, we published the archive edition of that.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And you did the right thing and you put it together with the Steve Englehart, Gil Kane
Absolutely.
issue, which when I went to see, when I was shown the original and my mind was blown, they said, oh yeah, and here's this one. So in the same half hour, this is how, again, gods were singing. And I just thought, oh my God, or angels were singing. I thought, this is fated. Like, how does this happen that a guy from, a guy who fell in love with The Prisoner as a kid in Ottawa is now seeing the original pages from Steve Englehart and Gil Kane and Jack Kirby, and like, this is nuts. But Kirby, there was Kirby had drawn a kind of statue, and he'd done some Portmeirion, and I said, we have to do the Distressed Village, and I want to see one of the big images in my head was a statue with the camera in the eye. And Dean, of course, got that immediately. He knew what that was. We're both Marshall McLuhan guys. We both, studied him, and I studied. I mean, McLuhan was one of my teachers, so we kind of had that whole background. But then, what do you do? And I remember working on it for about a week, and I was at my wit's end, and I went for a walk. There you go. I went for a walk, and he's talking to me. The number 6 is talking to me, and number 2, and I decided I'll do a monologue. I'll just have number 2 talk. So number 2, I wrote for 2 days, just him telling me about being a number 2. And then I said, okay, now we'll do number 6. And I was there, and I said, why are you in the village? And number 6 replied, I was free to go. So I was free to stay. And I was rocked. I was completely, I'm like, oh my God, like, this character is amazing that all of a sudden, he's such an ornery, crotchety, counter guy that makes perfect sense. I was free to go. So I stayed. So I thought, well, that's it. Now you've got your setting. Now you'll do it. And I called up, Dean and I would visit every week, and we would go to the Duncan Street Grill, which we called the Drunken Street Girl. And we would get together and plot it out. And I came to him, and my eyes must have been this big. And I said, Dean, I know how it can be in the village. And he's like, really? And I gave him the spiel, and he just went, oh my God, that's it. And then we knew we had it. And I guess I should have known we had it when I was holding the original pages by Gil Kane and Jack Kirby, because that was a sign. Like, that is a sign. And, it was a real, I thought, well, this will launch my career. This is, I'm going to get into comics. This is going to be great. And because of that, we toured The Prisoner in the UK in 1988. And that's where I met, a lot of the British creators. But at the end of the day, I ended up getting a job in TV, which was at just when I could have moved, in the writing comics direction. TV called, and I was like, well, I love comics, but I don't know what I should do. And it was friends who basically said, we need an evangelist. You've already proved that you're an evangelist. Go be an evangelist. And after a year, I resigned because I thought, well, I've done my thing and I can go, and I'll go to comics. And then a number of my friends and colleagues, particularly the comic book people, were like, no, you have a unique platform. You have a giant bullhorn. You have a half-hour television show on TV. You can't stop. And so that became 5 years of that. And then that became my career. So the whole thing is so weird, Andrew. I can't tell you. But all of it's been from love. I mean, I was an evangelist for The Prisoner, an evangelist for comics. And, I can't believe how lucky I've been. And really what I can't believe is how supportive the community is. Because when someone like Richard Bruning realizes this is your dream project, he helped makes it happen. People at the CBC and at TVO and at Space all recognized my passion. They all let me to do what I wanted to do. And it's a miracle because, I used to teach students, and the students and the interns would all say, well, how do you get from managing a comic book store to creating a television show? And that's the part of my career I don't understand. Like, that's the black box. Like, and you must have the same kind of thing. Like, how do you get from this guy to the guy? Like, what happens? And I don't know. It's like a vapor. I literally don't know what happened, except that people reached down, hands grabbed me and pulled me up the ladder. And I spent the last 20 years of my career reaching down and pulling people up, because that's what happened to me. And I knew that it would change my life. So I hope that it would change the lives of others.
I think that's very well said, mate. Of course, for me, it's the hardest degree of all, and here's why. Because I think that the situation that you're in, that beautiful alchemy of how that came about for you, which is almost impossible to explain, the sequence of causal links that caused that to happen. I think one of the things that sits at the heart of it, something I often talk about, is pop culture evangelism, because like yourself, it's been a primary interest of mine throughout my sentient waking life, since, and it's something I've been super conscious of since I was 3 years old. I mean, I can remember organizing a petition to bring the Adam West Batman show onto Granada TV, like when I was 7 in primary school, you know what I mean? And that is one of many. I don't think I've ever told anybody I've ever done that before, because the people I would have done it with will no doubt have long forgotten. But I absolutely did it. And it's like with yourself, mate. I think the alchemy of how that has come about comes as a result of your natural evangelism, your belief in the medium, not a genre medium, and you believed in that since day one. But also the fact that you're genuinely devoted to it, and you're a tremendous positivist, and it's an expression of positivism. I think that when things fall together in ways that you can't anticipate or predict, some of it is the ripple effect of how you treat people over a 30-year span, and things just come back like a boomerang that you can never expect, and doors get opened. And a part of your story that really spoke to me was you talking about people going along to space in its early incarnation and going, hey, look, man, I know Mark Askwith, right? Well, why are they saying that? That's because they've all had a positive experience with Mark Askwith. And that's the work of decades, mate. You don't do that. And so the reason it's hard to, and I know a couple of people are in this boat, the reason it's hard in a classical sense, it's not like being a solicitor or a famous like trial lawyer where you've gone to law school, I want to practice law, I want to be the best, I want to be the best trial lawyer. And it's a distinct career path. Your career has happened through alchemy and its glorious marriage with positivity as well. And I think that it's come out of you. You've self-actualized because you are a believer, you're an evangelist, but you're also a good bloke. People like you. And, that's the tale of our friendship over the last decade, right? The reason we know each other and instinctively know we have so much to talk about, we probably speak once a year, but it's an endless conversation. You know what I mean? Because you're a fellow traveller, mate. And I really recognise in you your belief and the fact that you have such a positive effect upon people. And I think you're far from the end of your life, but it's a wonderful epitaph to have.
Well, thank you. And I feel the same thing with you. And it was funny, early in my career, I began to see people who had kind of echo chamber careers, and the people you think, oh, maybe they would have gone one way, but they were seduced by whatever it is they were seduced by. And to me, it was comics. And my daughter is in her mid-20s, and for her, it's musical theater. And I remember saying to her that I didn't like musicals. And, well, Dad, which ones have you seen? I said, well, I've seen Cats and I've seen this and that. She goes, Dad, you haven't seen the right ones. And she's just as evangelistic about musicals as I am about comics. And we went and saw Fun Home, the brilliant production, adaptation musical of Alison Bechdel's graphic novel. And I was a huge, magnifying, boomer, whatever you want to call it, guy on a soapbox for that graphic novel, which I thought was brilliant. And we're sitting watching this. And at the end of the day, I was having dinner with my wife and daughter, and I turned to my daughter and I said, I think it's a better musical than it is a graphic novel. And she practically fell off her chair, but she had made an her evangelism affected me. And it was for the first time in my life, I realized, oh, this is the effect that I had on other people. And I have a friend who said, oh yeah, you telling me to read a book is like 10 other people telling me to write a book, or read a book. And I'm like, oh, and I just feel like we're very lucky. And I still don't understand how it happens. I'm being honest. And how does it happen for you? How does it happen for me? And, so many people that are mutual friends of ours, and you look at them and you go, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, our jobs, your job, Andrew, and my job did not exist when we were growing up.
Correct.
The idea
Absolutely
that we could do what we're doing literally had no place in popular culture. It had no place in the workplace. And, for me in the early 80s to say, I'm going to devote myself to this, it didn't make any, like, it literally, unless you worked for Marvel in DC, there was no way to have, and in fact, those would have limited our careers. And the careers that you and I have had, we're kind of like that great comic book character, the in-betweener, or, that kind of, we are between worlds. And
yes.
I somebody that I feel is a fellow traveler who I barely know, I've only met a few times, is Paul Gravett, who I feel.
Oh yeah, he 100% is. That's a very good shout, mate.
He's one of us. Like the moment I met him, I'm like, oh my God, he's like the British version of me. And, early on, people in the 80s, Neil Gaiman had written a book called Don't Panic. And I read that. And then Landau and Mike Lake made me read this, literally a Xerox of Violent Cases. And I knew right away, Neil is another one. I mean, I didn't know what he would be, but I knew that he was part of the Paul Gravett, Don Melia, Mark Askwith, and you, Andrew Sumner, and Igor Goldkind, Mike Lake.
Right. These
all
cats
of us
are all,
kind of moving. And no, most of it, I mean, even for me, I'm not an on-air host. So most people don't know who I am. You have a higher profile. But for the most part, my career is invisible. I am the iceberg. Like whatever you see whenever I get mentioned by somebody, it's this weird little glitchy thing. But then, you suddenly realize, because I've had people, one of my hosts, Teddy Wilson, said, oh my God, have you seen your Wikipedia? I'm like, I don't know how, literally, I don't know. I'll read it. And I went, oh my God, it's riddled with errors. And he goes, you must have written it. I said, I did not write this because you know me. I don't know how. But he goes, look at what you've done. Like, look at this, what you've done. And I have no sense of what I've done because I knit my parachute on the way down. I knew where I wanted to land. I wanted to land in the heart of popular culture. And I just aimed towards that. And if I could do it in radio, I would have appreciated that. If I could do it as a writer, but the pathway was TV. And I found it toxic and difficult and horrible and many things. It's just not a life for a human being. And yet 30 years of my life is making television about popular culture and growing to love the people and the industry and the kind of the whole encasement of that kind of culture, working with editors and cameramen. I learned more from, my interns and from my cameramen and from my editors than I ever learned in school. Brilliant, brilliant people, because they were all storytellers and they all gravitated towards storytelling. And the medium that was vibrant was television. And so that's where they all ended up. And I'm old enough where the vibrant medium was radio. So of course I would be drawn there, but then the curtain had already closed on that medium. And the medium that was opening up was television. And, I didn't really, because of my age, I didn't really understand the power of television quite the way other people did, because that's a few years later.
Yeah.
But then, it's weird. It's just weird. And now it's weird because here we are. And you can do hard agree and you can call up anybody you want. Pretty much everybody is going to say yes. And we all say yes because we're all part of team hard agree.
We're all part of that universe. And, it's the opposite of the Groucho Marx syndrome, right? I'm not a joiner, but I'm very much proud to be a part of this ecosystem of comic book culture people. It's something that's always drawn, because I had, like yourself, I had a very mainstream publishing career. I worked on health service magazines to begin with. Then I wrote for and published mainstream magazines, where even within the mainstream media of men's and music, my absolute devotion to comics was considered to be quite extreme and eccentric. And then I published a bunch of celebrity magazines, which, by the way, I absolutely wasn't interested in at all. And then I ran Cahiers du Cinema in France for a while, which is the antithesis of the kind of culture we're talking about, right? But I always felt like an outsider within mainstream media. And the minute that I had the chance to align my actual career with my personal media interests, it was just like walking through a portal into a whole other world. And it was like, oh man, I really am at home. It's like being given the keys to the Batcave.
Yeah. Well, it took me 5 years to call myself a television producer because I thought, well, I'm not. I'm a comic book guy who does comic book things on a show that's about comics and science. Like, I'm a nerd. Like, I am not a television producer. I don't smoke cigars. I don't look that way. I'm not, hey, let's do this. No, that's not me. And the joy of the job was meeting Michael Moorcock and interacting with him. And then, Mike, it's so many, like thousands of people. And at the end of the day, very few of them become friends. I mean, most of them just become people you've interviewed. But clearly they affected you and you affected them at some level. And I don't know how that happens. I think it's the great privilege of being a journalist. And it's funny because somebody asked me a while ago about, where did your career come from and what was your interest in comics? And the first comic I fell in love with was at the age of 4, and it was Tintin by Hergé. And I realized that everything he's a journalist who travels the world, and it's comic books. And that's my life. My life is Tintin. I am Tintin. I wanted to be him at the age of 4. I got to be him. Not quite exactly the same way. I didn't get to go inside a submarine that looked like a shark. I didn't go on,
you didn't get to look for Red Rackham's treasure. Yeah.
I never got to look for the treasure. I never got to go to the moon. But I met people who went to the moon. I met people like, who went under the water in submersibles, like Phil Newton. I met, James Cameron, like I look back and I go, and what separates all of us who are into this is at the heart of it, we love storytelling and we want to be a part of that tradition. So we tell the stories and we let storytellers tell their stories.
Well said, brother. Well said. And I really love the way you expressed all of that. And two things that you've said within this closing section of the show that I've really responded to very strongly was the analogy between yourself and Tintin et Milou, or Tintin and Snowy. It's such a, I've never thought of it that way before, but of course, he's a journalist who travels the world within the comic book medium. I'm going to use that myself. And it's one of two things you said I'm going to use myself, because I'm going to say farewell to you as Mark Askwith, my friend, writer, producer, and the man who knitted his own parachute on the way down, which I think is such a wonderful expression. Such a wonderful expression. I'm amazed I haven't stolen it from somebody else before now. But I'm going to use it from now on, because that is, as you know, it's also how I feel. And I think your expression of that has been fascinating, and it's just been such a great deal of fun, as it always is, chatting with you, brother.
Me to you. Thank you so much. This is a real honor. So glad to be part of this, and we must do it again. We will do it again, Mark, because there's a whole avalanche of topics that we haven't even touched upon. Wonderful. Gotta go.
Yeah.
Love you.
Take care, brother. Love you too. You've been listening to Hard Agree. This episode was edited by John Horsley and Kenrick Regan, and our theme music, Golden, was written and performed for this show by Liverpool's finest band, Denio. Hard Agree is a production of the Spoilerverse and myself, Andrew Sumner.